Chapter 2. Lord, Liar or Lunatic. The distinct claims of Jesus to be God eliminate the popular ploy of skeptics who regard Jesus as just a good moral man or a prophet who said a lot of profound things. So often that conclusion is passed off as the only one acceptable to scholars, or as the obvious result of the intellectual process. The trouble is, many people nod their heads in agreement and never see the fallacy of such reasoning. I have to say I'm with Josh so far. I do think that's not the only option. To Jesus, who men and women believed him to be was of fundamental importance. To say what Jesus said and to claim what he claimed about himself, one couldn't conclude he was just a good moral man or prophet. That alternative isn't open to an individual, and Jesus never intended it to be. So according to Josh, I suppose, Jesus was trying to make it very clear that he wasn't just a good moral man or a prophet, that he had to be something more than that. And I guess that's what we're getting in chapter 1, that Jesus is claiming to be God, which is a point of contention in academia because, like I think I said before, that some of the older versions of the Bible don't actually say that, or at least not in all the Gospels. And there certainly seems to be some rewriting of that after the fact. One of the things that the Jews often point to about Christianity, of course. I do think it is possible, though, unlike Josh says, to conclude that he is a good moral man and a prophet, but perhaps also a person who had ideas of grandeur or some crazy ideas if we do accept that Jesus was claiming to be God. It certainly isn't mutually exclusive anyway. I'll continue. C.S. Lewis, who was a professor at Cambridge University and once an agnostic, understood this issue clearly. He writes, "I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claims to be God. This is one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sorts of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse." Then Lewis adds, "You can shut him up for a fool. You can split at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to." Wow. Okay. I mean, that's one of the things that I hear a lot of Christians using as a good argument or what they think is a good argument for Jesus, is that Jesus came along with these teachings and love thy neighbor and all this kind of stuff. And can't you see that that's the right way and that he was trying to guide humanity? And here we have C.S. Lewis, and seemingly Josh McDowell endorsing it, saying that these aren't good lessons. These are the lessons of a madman who considers himself a poached egg, or of Satan. And I've certainly got issues with some of the things Jesus said. I think the Sermon on the Mount is certainly problematic if you look at it in depth, and that's one of the ones that's held up as a great moral lesson by some as well. But I don't think I even take a stronger position as C.S. Lewis here and says that he's the devil, a poached egg, or the omnipotent God, because the only way you could make sense of what he's saying is through that kind of lens. I do think some of the things he said, although perhaps not entirely correct, at least made sense on some level. You don't have to be completely nuts. But I suppose it supports this false trichotomy that we're being presented, the Lord, Liar, or Lunatic argument. That it has to be one of those. It couldn't be some amalgamation or somewhere in between. I'll continue. F.J.A. Hort, who spent 28 years in a critical study of the New Testament text, writes, "His words were so completely parts and utterances of himself that they had no meaning as abstract statements of truth uttered by him as a divine oracle or prophet. Take away himself as the primary, although not the ultimate, subject of every statement, and they all fall to pieces." That's another interesting one, saying that his words are madness if you don't understand him to be God. Certainly true of some of the things he said, but I don't think you need that context for love thy neighbor. Continuing. In the words of Kenneth Scott Latourette, historian of Christianity at Yale University, it is not his teachings which makes Jesus so remarkable, although these would be enough to give him distinction. It is a combination of his teachings with the man himself. The two cannot be separated. It must be obvious, Latourette concludes, to any thoughtful reader of the gospel records that Jesus regarded himself and his message as inseparable. He was a great teacher, but he was more. His teachings about the kingdom of God, about human conduct, and about God were important. But they could not be divorced from him without, from his standpoint, being vitiated. Again, I really disagree that you need to consider the message of Jesus as being bound to him, as if these are ideas that rely upon the idea of a son of God and things like that. There are certainly a number of teachers who have come before and after who have said many of the same teachings as Jesus, and they make sense, even abstract the idea of him being the son of God. I mean, certainly I understand why for a lot of theists it provides more oomph from a deity or a son of God. But they're certainly not the incomprehensible ramblings of a madman that they seem to be making out, ironically. Continuing, Jesus claimed to be God. He didn't leave any other options open. His claim must have been true or false. So it is something that should be given serious consideration. Jesus' question to his disciples, "But who do you say that I am?" Matthew 16:15, has several alternatives. First, consider that his claim to be God was false. If it were false, then we have two and only two alternatives. He either knew it was false, or he didn't know it was false. We will consider each one separately and examine the evidence. So I suppose where we're going to go here is that if he knew it was false, then he was a liar. And if he didn't know it was false, then he must be a lunatic or telling the truth. Which, is an interesting premise. Not sure that I follow it entirely, but we'll see how we go as we go along. So this section is called, "Was he a liar?" If, when Jesus made his claims, he knew that he was not God, then he was lying and deliberately deceiving his followers. But if he was a liar, then he was also a hypocrite, because he told others to be honest, whatever the cost, while he himself taught and lived a colossal lie. More than that, he was a demon, because he told others to trust him for their eternal destiny. Not sure that's something that only demons do, but okay. If he couldn't back up his claims, and he knew it, then he was unspeakably evil. Last, he would also be a fool, because it was his claims to being God that led to his crucifixion. Certainly people do things that aren't foolish, but still have bad consequences. But I do think it was kind of silly to profess to be a god. But as I understand it, there was quite a few religious leaders at that time, or cult leaders at that time, professing to be spiritual and things like that. And if misleading people makes you a demon, and telling them to trust you in your eternal destiny, then I mean, I wouldn't call that a demon. That's not really a supernatural thing. That's just somebody being a specific kind of asshole. But we certainly still have cult leaders like that today. Many will say that Jesus was a good moral teacher. Let's be realistic. How could he be a great moral teacher and knowingly mislead people at the most important point of his teachings, his own identity? Yes, because of course, one couldn't say things that are true and good and also do bad things some other times. Those are two mutually exclusive things. You can't have elements of good and elements of bad. I think you'll find that when you talk a lot about psychopaths or cult leaders, you find they're very charismatic and they actually do have good teachings and things that make sense initially, and they tend to rope people in. And that's actually part of the deception. It isn't mutually exclusive to it. You would have to conclude logically that he was a deliberate liar or narcissistic, and it begins as a lie and gets into your head and these ideas of grandeur. Anyway, this view of Jesus, however, doesn't coincide with what we know either of him or the results of his life and teachings. Wherever Jesus has been proclaimed, lives have been changed for the good, nations have changed for the better, thieves are made honest, alcoholics are cured, hateful individuals become channels of love, unjust people become just. That is not always true. There was a number of people that came into contact with Jesus who hated Jesus. Some of them, as Josh pointed out earlier, crucified him and were very angry. So it's certainly not a universal truth that everyone who came into contact with Jesus was made good. But, yep, it's certainly true of some if you read the book that is attempting to glorify Jesus. William Lecky, one of Great Britain's most noted historians and a dedicated opponent of Christianity, writes, "It was reserved for Christianity to present to the world an ideal character which through all the changes of 18th century have inspired the hearts of men with an impassioned love. It has shown itself capable of acting on all ages, nations, temperaments, and conditions, and has been not only the highest pattern of virtue, but the strongest incentive to the practice. The simple record of these 3 years of active life has done more to regenerate and soften mankind than all the disquisitions of philosophers and all the exhortations of moralists." That is an absurd statement. But I guess that's something that a guy who opposes Christianity said, that Christianity changed the world. It certainly did change the world. I'm not sure that I would say it did more than all the philosophers. And I think there's, again, the case that this isn't mutually exclusive, that a lot of philosophy has been, has influenced Christianity, and in turn, Christianity has been enhanced and interpreted through certain lens by philosophers and theologians. Continuing on, historian Philip Schaff said, "This testimony, if not true, must be downright blasphemy or madness. The former hypothesis cannot stand a moment before the moral purity and dignity of Jesus, revealed in every word and work, and acknowledged by universal consent. Self-deception in a matter so momentous, and with an intellect in all respects so clear and so sound, is equally out of the question. How could he be an enthusiast or a madman who never lost the even balance of his mind, who sailed serenely over all the troubles and persecutions as the sun above the clouds, who always returned the wisest answer to tempting questions, who calmly and deliberately predicted his death on the cross, his resurrection on the third day, the outpouring of his Holy Spirit, and the founding of his church, the destruction of Jerusalem, predictions which have been literally fulfilled. A character so original, so complete, so uniformly consistent, so perfect, so human, and yet so high above all human greatness, can be neither a fraud nor a fiction. The poet, as has been well said, would in this case be greater than the hero. It would take more than a Jesus to invent a Jesus." What a bizarre ending to that. But also, how crazy is so many of the things in there. They said he has an intellect that's so clear and sound in all respects, and yet this completely contradicts what Josh was saying earlier about how these ideas have to be mad if they were not out of the Word of God. So these are not clear ideas and sound ideas. These are the ideas of a madman, is precisely what Josh was arguing earlier. And they said that he sailed serenely over all the troubles and persecutions. And that's not true. He cursed a fig bush. He said, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" on the cross. He has that whole scene where he flips over the tables in the temple and whips people. That time he doesn't wash his hands, and then he yells at all the Pharisees about, what was it, about, oh, they're not obeying God's rules either because they don't kill the children that curse their mothers and fathers. He's certainly not always this calm, deliberate person that what's the historian's name? Historian Philip Schaff says. And I don't think he has the wisest answer to every question. It says that he refuses temptations as well, which isn't true. There's that whole scene in Matthew, a whole chapter about how the devil tempts him in the forest to do all these things, including answering a bunch of questions, which is one of the things this historian specifically says he doesn't do. Anyway, elsewhere, Schaff gives convincing argument against Christ being a liar. How, in the name of logic, common sense, and experience, could an impostor, that is, a deceitful, selfish, depraved man, have invented and consistently maintained, from beginning to end, the purest and noblest character known in history, with the most perfect air of truth and reality? How could he have conceived and successfully carried out a plan of unparalleled beneficence, moral magnitude, and sublimity, and sacrifice his own life for it, in the face of the strongest prejudices of his people and his age? Which I suppose could be asked of almost any cult leader at the time, where their books and their followers say that they're the purest truth and most representative of reality and moral benevolence and all these things. Certainly a book that advocates and is trying to tell people that this is a religious leader has made that person consistent from beginning to end. Well, mostly consistent. If Jesus wanted to get people to follow him and believe in him as God, why did he go to the Jewish nation? Why did he go as a Nazarene carpenter to a country so small in size and population and so thoroughly adhering to the undivided unity of God? Why didn't he go to Egypt, or even more, to Greece, where they'd believed in various gods and various manifestations of them? Or elsewhere in Asia? Good questions. Someone who lived as Jesus, lived, taught as Jesus taught, and died as Jesus died, could not have been a liar. What other alternatives are there? Does he really just ask that question and then not answer it at all? It goes on to the next chapter is, was he a lunatic? But it literally just says about why does he go to a country so small, as if that's a rhetorical question. I don't even understand the point he's trying to make there. Is the idea that if he was a liar just trying to build a civilization, he would go to the biggest place? Is that the logic? Why does the place have anything to do with it? Why is it not? He could still be a liar and have gone to a small place. He could have gone to the place and then decided to be a liar. It's a really weak point, but it's also not one that's even clear at all. And he just leaves us on that. That is meant to be the strong conclusion to how he obviously couldn't be a liar, because a liar wouldn't go to Jerusalem. A liar would go somewhere much bigger, apparently, where there's more structured opposition and where they would kill you as a heretic. Obviously not. If he was a liar and he went to the Jewish nation, and that could all be part of the game plan. I don't understand how he's ruled that out. Anyway, was he a lunatic? If it is inconceivable for Jesus to be a liar, it's not, Josh. Then couldn't he actually have thought himself to be God, but have been mistaken? After all, it's possible to be both sincere and wrong, But we must remember that for someone to think himself God, especially in a fiercely monotheistic culture, and then to tell others and their eternal destiny depended on believing in him, it's no flight of fancy, but the thoughts of a lunatic in the fullest sense. Was Jesus such a person? Someone who believes he is God sounds like somebody today believing he's Napoleon. He would be deluded and self-deceived, and probably he would be locked up so he wouldn't hurt himself or anyone else. Yet in Jesus, we don't observe the anomalies and imbalances that usually go along with being deranged. His poise and composure would certainly be amazing if he were insane. As we've already discussed, that's not true. But also, he could have just been nuts, and those bits have been cut from the text because the text has been altered over time. It was written by people who followed him decades after the fact. So it's highly plausible that they would cut out a lot of the insane scenes. They didn't even cut out all of them. Continuing. Noyes and Kolb in a medical text describe the schizophrenia as a person who is more autistic than realistic. The schizophrenic desires to escape from the world of reality. Let's face it, claiming to be God would certainly be a retreat from reality. In light of other things we know about Jesus, it's hard to imagine that he was mentally disturbed. Here is a man who spoke some of the most profound sayings ever recorded. His instructions have liberated many individuals in mental bondage. Clark H. Pinnock asks, was he deluded about his greatness? A paranoid, an unintentional deceiver, a schizophrenic? Again, the skill and depth of his teachings supports the case only for his total mental soundness. If only we were as sane as he, a student at a California university told me that his psychological professor had said that all the classes need to do is pick up the Bible and read portions of Christ's teachings to many of his patients. That's all the counseling they need. Wow, that's really concerning. Some people have serious problems that they need addressing. They don't just need to listen to Christ's teachings about, fishing and bread and loving their neighbor and turning another cheek. Some people don't need to turn another cheek. Some people need to stand up for themselves. That's troubling. Psychiatrist T.J. Fisher states, if you were to take the sum total of all authoritative articles ever written by the most qualified of psychologists and psychiatrists on the subject of mental hygiene, if you were to combine them and refine them and cleave out all the excess verbiage, if you were to take the whole of the meat and none of the parsley, and if you were to have these unadulterated bits of pure scientific knowledge concisely expressed by the most capable of living poets, you would have an awkward and incomplete summation of the Sermon on the Mount, and it would suffer immeasurably through comparison. For nearly 2,000 years, the Christian world has been holding in its hands the complete answer to its restless and fruitless yearnings. Here rests the blueprint for successful human life with optimism, mental health, and contentment. Now, I don't have time to go through the entirety of the Sermon on the Mount as much as I'd love to. Here is not the place for it. But this is the one that says, blessed are the poor because they shall be fulfilled in heaven or whatever. It encourages you to stop worrying about your earthly problems because you've got heavenly reward, and it says, to save not for tomorrow and turn the other cheek because you'll get into heaven and whatever happens on earth doesn't matter. And this Hakuna Matata, it means no worries, just worry about the afterlife, might make people in the moment feel well, but it's not a healthy way of navigating one's life to just disregard it and treat it like a doormat because you'll have riches in heaven. Even if that's true, you'll find yourself wholly unsatisfied in this current life because you need to treat this current life as your only life and to treat yourself with respect so that you don't just turn the other cheek always. Not that you shouldn't have mercy, obviously, but that you shouldn't be mistreated and accept that. Just have a read through the Sermon on the Mount and think of it critically, because a lot of these messages, while they seem rosy on the outside, if taken too seriously or to their proper conclusions, are quite problematic. I certainly don't think that's the entirety of psychology either. I don't think that's represented in the Sermon on the Mount. C.S. Lewis writes, "The historical difficulty of giving for the life, sayings, and influence of Jesus any explanation that is not harder than the Christian explanation is very great. The discrepancy between the depth and sanity of his moral teaching and the rampant megalomania which must lie behind his theological teachings, unless he is indeed God, have never been satisfactorily explained. Hence, the non-Christian hypotheses succeed one another with the restless fertility of bewilderment. Philip Schaff reasons, is such an intellect, clear as the sky, bracing as the mountain air, sharp and penetrating as a sword, thoroughly healthy and vigorous, always ready and always self-possessed, liable to a radical and most serious delusion concerning his own character and mission? Preposterous imagination." So I guess the idea that he is a lunatic is crazy, because some of the time he acts rationally and reasonable. And I don't know if you have ever met people with certain mental abnormalities, that are bipolar or schizophrenia, but they can be very rational people a lot of the time. Very normal, even extraordinarily calm people, and then have these wild outbursts and have inconsistencies in logic and hear things that aren't there and things like that. It's not enough to say that a person is either calm and rational or insane. A lot of people can be somewhere in the middle, or they can be one of those things sometimes and another thing another time. Which brings us on to, was he Lord? I cannot personally conclude that Jesus was a liar or a lunatic. The only other alternative is that he was Christ, the Son of God, as he claimed. Well, I guess we've got rid of Occam's razor, guys. Occam's razor, seems unlikely he was lying and unlikely he was a lunatic, and therefore he must be the literal Son of God, a divine deity, the likes of which we've never seen before. That's the most likely explanation. Anyway, when I discuss this with most Jewish people, it's interesting how they respond. They usually tell me that Jesus was a moral, upright, religious leader, a good man, or some kind of prophet. And now we know that's crazy because of what he said in chapter 1. I then share with them the claims that Jesus made about himself, and then the material in this chapter on the trilemma, liar, lunatic, or Lord. When I ask if they believe Jesus was a liar, there is a sharp no. Then I ask, do you think he was a lunatic? They reply, of course not. Do you believe he is God? And before I can get a breath in edgewise, there is a resounding absolutely not. Yet one has only so many choices. Yes, Josh, because those aren't the only choices. It could be that he was written to be proclaiming to be the literal Son of God rather than a figurative Son of God in the way that we're all sons of God as his creation. It could be that he was written as that afterwards, that these were claims that he never made. Or it could be that he proclaimed to be the Son of God and that he's not a lunatic, that this is a claim they believe isn't true, but it's not sufficient to say that the man was completely mad and wrong about everything else he said. I don't think, Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il or Caesar or any of the other various leaders who have professed themselves to be, semi-divine or something like that are crazy people. They're megalomaniac to some extent, but not completely insane. The issue with these three alternatives is not which is possible, for it is obvious that all three are possible, but rather the question is, which is more probable? Who you decide Jesus Christ is must not be an idle intellectual exercise. You cannot put him on the shelf as a great moral teacher, that is not a valid option, despite the fact that later on in the chapter, he argues that the Sermon on the Mount is like the most logical divine thing. You also can't say that he's a moral teacher. I don't understand this man. He completely contradicts himself. Anyway, you can't say he's a moral teacher. That's not a valid option. He is either a liar, a lunatic, or Lord and God, and you must make a choice. But, as the Apostle John wrote, these have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and, more important, that believing you might have life in his name. John 20:31. The evidence is clearly in favor of Jesus as Lord. Some people, however, reject the clear evidence because of the moral implications involved. They don't want to face up to the responsibility or implications of calling him Lord. And I guess I don't want to own up to the responsibilities of calling him Lord, but I don't even think that would be that bad. It certainly would be nice for there to be an afterlife, and clearly written rules on how to navigate one's life. Although I obviously don't agree with all the rules. However, it doesn't need to be that we dismiss these arguments because of moral implications. I do think there's a number of... Well, first off, it's a false trichotomy. It's not either Lord, liar, or lunatic. It could be Lord, liar, lunatic, or, written character that, like I said, that these aren't claims that he necessarily made, but fancifications made after the fact, which is quite probable, which would make him one of these good moral teachers that he was talking about, and that those other claims were just added after the fact. Or if you also accept the other thing that Josh McDowell says, he's not a good moral teacher. He simultaneously got the Sermon on the Mount, which is some of the best moral and psychological teachings, but also to consider him a moral teacher is crazy madness. Anyway, that was chapter 2 of More Than a Carpenter. Chapter 3 is What About Science? Which is a great question, Josh, and we'll find out next time. Thanks.